With apologies for the little delay, we're now ready to go. And so I'm going to jump right back into what we've been talking about, and right, the question of how we understand the distinctiveness of what is going on in the human mind in an age in which it appears that machines, computers, various forms of technology increasingly approximate, resemble, exceed human cognitive capacities. And so we start with philosophy. I'm going to switch into psychology and neuroscience in a little bit, but we've got to get through the philosophy. And so continuing with the examination of the differences between ancient philosophical and modern philosophical approaches. And today we're going to shift to the modern philosophical approaches, last week having spent some time with the ancients. So very quickly, again, just to refresh your memory, we're making our way down to genealogies of intellectual development, one of them philosophical, one of them psychological, cognitive, scientific, and ultimately to do with brain science. And we've talked about some of the differences in these methods, that philosophy gives us a more introspective perspective. It takes seriously the first person standpoint, the point of view that says, I have subjective experience of myself, and no account of what's going on in my mind is adequate unless you are able to actually do justice to what I think I am experiencing. And the more psychological or objectivating approach, which says, well, you think you know what's going on in your mind, but it turns out that there's a lot more going on, and that actually what may cause you to experience what you experience is very different from what you experience. And so we need to not only have a first person perspective, but a third person or an objectivating perspective. And my suggestion has been that both of these approaches are worth exploring, and that, in fact, there's no reason to regard them as mutually incompatible, despite the territorial dispute between psychology and philosophy and brain science, that we can learn from alternating between different approaches, as opposed to thinking we've simply got to choose one. With that in mind, we started with philosophy. We spent a fair bit of time looking at Plato and Aristotle last week, and to very briefly reprise Aristotle. Well, let me start with Plato. Plato says, when we use our senses to understand the world, we are typically misled either by the way in which the world is constantly in flux all around us, or by the limits of our sensation. Whereas when we contemplate mathematical truths, we don't have to worry about either the world changing, because those are invariant truths of mathematical logic and reason, nor do we have to worry about sensation, because they are given to us via pure intellect. And not only that, but we can ascend from mathematics to pure philosophy, to understanding the nature of the forms that transcend both the material world and our experience of it. And with that knowledge in place, we can then understand deep truths about the nature of being as such, which will equip us to make sense of the variability of the world and our sensory experience of it. Those truths are metaphysical, not physical. They are ontological, into the nature of being as such, and they provide us with the higher order knowledge we need to lead our lives. Once we have contemplated the form of the good, we will have a sense of goodness as such, and that can serve as our moral compass for the rest of our lives, all of our other activities. Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, says to his teacher, no, I don't think we need to turn our heads out of the world. We can actually look into the world and find metaphysical truth about the nature of being in the world itself, because each thing has its reason, its purpose, its end, its telos. And through appropriate philosophical analysis, we can discover what the thing aims at, what its justifying purpose is. And of course, we can do this not only for the acorn that aims to be an oak, but for the human being that aims to either realize its full capacity for perfection in action, in political activity, or in contemplation and philosophical thought. Those are the two activities that perfect us, given the nature of the capacities that we possess as human beings. And both of these themes, the Platonic and the Aristotelian models of knowing our true nature and highest ends through knowing the world. The motto here might be the truth is out there. And both of these themes are taken up by Christian theology, where contemplating God and God's revealed truths takes the place of contemplating the form, and putting one's soul in order so as to be qualified for salvation is the highest order purpose of human existence. Platonic and Aristotelian themes taken up in Christian theology. Perhaps Athens actually won the battle with Jerusalem by philosophizing religion, turning it into theology. So those themes then get translated for, let us say, 2,000 years from Athens through Jerusalem to Christendom, and we have a fairly continuous understanding of the way in which our minds operate, what's of value or worth in them, what the capacities we contain are, where knowing the world, or knowing something above and beyond the world, exercising our intellect, is the key faculty, the key dimension of our cognitive life that differentiates us from the animals and accounts for our specific worth and value. We then noted, right, that the ancient world view, as preserved in Christianity and transmitted all the way through the threshold of the early modern period, begins to falter and come apart because of the challenges of Renaissance humanism, the Reformation, the on the one hand, the idea that pre-Christian civilization may have exceeded Christian civilization in many respects, and on the other hand, that Christian civilization is not able to generate unanimity or consensus on the answer to even the essential question of how to interpret the divine text. The sacred doctrine itself is controversial, and that controversy appears to be irresolvable. And then we have science coming on the scene and presenting an entirely different model of knowing the world, in which we perhaps do not have any privileged access into the nature of being, either the being of the world or the being of ourselves. But by formulating hypothesis, we can slowly but surely better approximate our understanding of the world to the rules and laws that the world itself follows, right? And so we're demoting the intellect in terms of both the importance of what it reveals and its capacity to garner knowledge into the nature of things as such. And then we get this skeptical revolution, which is where I want to turn to begin our conversation today. And so that means I'm going to turn primarily, or at least initially, to Rene Descartes, and then to the work of Thomas Hobbes, and eventually David Hume. And so let me start with Descartes, and I'll give you just a little bit of biographical background on Descartes. Descartes is French, though he spends a fair bit of his life outside of France. In France, he's a commoner. That means even though he's clearly a genius, right? And Descartes is recognized in his own time as one of the leading polymaths of Europe. He's not just a renowned philosopher, but he's also an incredibly important mathematician. He actually invents the field of analytic geometry, a field that we're still using to this day. And his mathematical and scientific acumen have clear practical implications. He ends up spending a lot of his time working for other militaries, and not the French, because he's a commoner, so he can't be distinguished, but other Middle European militaries are very happy to employ him. He spends his life as a Catholic surrounded by Protestants. As a result, a man of science, a complicated figure, but in particular, at that relatively early age, 23 years old, Descartes has this epiphany, which is that he could be completely deceived by all of his senses, that there could be an evil demon who was manipulating him into seeing the world around him. And so this is one way of motivating radical skepticism. What if everything you see isn't just fluid or malleable in flux? And what if our senses aren't just unreliable, but in fact, there is something pulling the wool over our eyes and suggesting to us something entirely different from our experience, right? The movie The Matrix, right, envisions us as, quote, minds in jars or bodies in tanks, in which everything that is going on in our brains is pumped into us in order to delude us so that we stay complacently serving as batteries for robots. And obviously that's a sci-fi scenario, but 100 years before The Matrix, Rene Magritte, the great French surrealist, whose paintings I think are really very valuable in explaining many of these philosophical themes, painted the painting that I have on the slide here, which is called The Human Condition, right? And if you look carefully at this painting, what you will see is you have a window drawn open with a cloudy day and some mountains and greenery in front, out the window. And then in front of the window, inside of the room, you have a representation of what is outside the window. But the representation is so accurate and so continuous with what's outside the window that you tend not to notice it, right? You notice it because there's an easel, because there's a clip, because it actually is in front of the curtain just a little bit, and because you see just the edge of the canvas, right? But you have to be paying attention to notice the tendency to confuse the representation for the thing itself. And then if you pull back from that for a second, you will say to yourself, wait a sec, the whole thing's a painting, right? And what I typically do with paintings is to confuse a one-dimensional scene created by paint with a three-dimensional reality. And by the way, this is exactly the human condition, that what we have when we sense the world is something in our brains, right? In our minds. And we now know even more than Descartes knew that our brains and our minds are locked away in our skulls, and nothing of the world, except for maybe when we're concussed, directly impacts the mind or the brain, right? The indirect input that is generating everything you see right now and everything you hear, touch, feel in your day to day existence from the day you're born till the day you die is a representation in various regions of the brain of what your sense organs are delivering via nerves that send electrochemical signals into the brain that then activate different regions that then say to you, that's a painting of a window with a mountain scene and cloudy sky behind it. You are confusing the thing going on inside your head for something in the world. And by the way, that's not a criticism, because if we didn't treat the mental representation of the sensory input that is constantly bombarding us as the world, we would be paralyzed. We would have no capacity to act in the world, right? And so it is a necessary illusion to confuse the mental representation of the world for the world. But having said that, Descartes also said, for that reason, we should not be confident that anything that we sense, any aspect of our mental life, is real. And then this is the fundamental philosophical pivot to modernity, to move away from the idea that the intellect or knowledge somehow gives us genuine insight into the nature of the world. One way to put this is the truth may be out there, but we don't have access to it. And therefore, if what we value in our cognitive capacity in our mind is our capacity for knowing the truth, well, then there's not much to value. And so, having said all of that, let me get a little bit more into the details of Descartes. He starts the meditations with this idea of putting himself in a quiet, as it turns out, quite hot room to try to just isolate his own thinking and be able to suspend belief, to entertain radical doubt about everything that he senses. And he in that work, and then especially in the Discourse on Method, puts epistemology, the theory of knowledge, how do we know what we know, at the center of modern philosophy and method, right? Using systematic doubt and then a kind of almost axiomatic or mathematical approach of moving from a secure proposition to what else can be derived from that proposition at the center of modern philosophy. And so Descartes really is this earthquake, this beginning of a new way of thinking about philosophy. He, of course, famously in the Meditations formulates his backstop, his ultimate escape hatch from radical doubt in what's come to just be called the cogito or the cogito, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And the basic idea here is there is one thing that I cannot doubt, which is that I think. And the person who is in the grips of radical skepticism, doubt about the verifiability of the external world, cannot doubt that they are having those skeptical thoughts. There is one thing that they are certain of, and that is that there is an I that is entertaining skeptical thoughts. And right, it would be incoherent, it would be a contradiction to deny that, because without that, there is no subject to be entertaining the doubt to begin with. And what Descartes ultimately does on this basis is to erect much greater certainty about knowledge. But in order to do so, he uses a fundamental religious postulate. And that religious postulate is that because I know I'm having these thoughts, there is a thinking being in the world. That much I can be certain of. How can there be a thinking being in the world? And here Descartes makes what many consider to be this profound and troublesome leap into theological certitude, saying there could only be a thinking being if that being had been created by another being. And who or what has the power to create a thinking being? God, who creates man in his image. Can I think the idea of God as an evil demon creating a thinking being? No, the project of creating a thinking being is a good project. It's a project of putting freedom and knowledge and morality into the world, and only a benevolent God would do that. And a benevolent God would not create us with senses that are subject to deceit by an evil demon, right? And so Descartes descends into the depths of radical skepticism only to find a lifeline out. That lifeline is, on the one hand, self-certainty. I know that I am thinking. The idea that the I that thinks has minimum capacity for rational cognition, and that therefore I must be divinely created. And I want to point out two things about this, and perhaps some of us find this to be convincing, but I think the vast majority of Descartes' contemporaries and the people who have studied him since then find the reliance on a theological postulate, on a benevolent God, and the idea that only a benevolent God can have created a reasoning being, to be flimsy, to not do the work that Descartes requires of his argument. And therefore, in a sense, what Descartes passes on to modern philosophical thought is not the religious / rationalist solution to the problem of skepticism, so much as the method of radical doubt, and how corrosive doubt is once you express it in this radical form, that the conclusion is neither Plato nor Aristotle nor traditional Christian theology and doctrine have a way of answering Cartesian doubt. And so perhaps ironically, it is the method and the starting point and not the edifice, the conclusion that Descartes reaches and constructs, that are his chief inheritance for modern philosophy. The other couple points I want to make here is that Descartes is, in a sense, illicitly continuing ancient dualism. We concluded last week by talking a little bit about this, the idea that there's fundamentally a difference between the intellect and the body and the senses, right? And that whether we use the intellect to discern philosophical forms or to understand metaphysical purposes and aims of everything in the universe, that is a faculty distinct from our embodied selves, our senses, etc. And Descartes is very much reproducing, if somewhat illicitly, this fundamental dualism, and maybe even radicalizing it. The only thing I can be certain of is the I think, and the fact that the process of thought allows for rational cognition is the central, indubitable nature of the human mind. Everything else could be wrong, could be deceitful, but that much I'm certain of, right? And so that splits us again from our bodies, from our senses, from the world, and suggests that it's the divine in us, not the animal in us, that is the lifeline, as well as the thing to be celebrated. There's another aspect of Descartes that I just want to focus on here for a moment, and that is, I've very quickly moved from I think to I am to therefore there is a God, therefore I'm not deceived. And I am obviously giving a quick lecture or a portion of a lecture on Descartes. There's a lot more I could be doing with the text if we were doing a long seminar on Descartes. But having said that, I don't think, in a sense, there would be that much more to say about the I of the I think and I am. That Descartes employs a philosophically thin conception of the subject without recognizing, as so many subsequent philosophers will, that the nature of the I in I think, therefore I am, is itself philosophically puzzling and potentially problematic. What exactly is the I? What exactly is the experience of subjective consciousness that we tend to identify with ourselves? And we'll see, right? This puzzles a whole bunch of philosophers, especially Kant and Hegel, and they suggest one problem with the cogito, with I think, therefore I am, is that it doesn't give us a clear answer to what exactly is this I that thinks. And if we don't have an answer to that, then really we don't have much insight into who we are or what is going on in our minds. So with that introduction to Descartes, I want to move into Thomas Hobbes' thought a little bit. And Thomas Hobbes is a rough contemporary of Descartes. He's born a little bit later. He lives a lot longer. You can see that Descartes dies exactly at the middle of the 17th century, which is, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, that's when the British are fighting their civil war. And Hobbes' great philosophical work, the Leviathan, is produced at the end of the Civil War. Hobbes and Descartes knew each other. They corresponded about philosophy as well as about mathematics, optics, other aspects of science. But Hobbes ultimately concluded that Descartes underestimated, really misunderstood the power of his own skepticism. And so I'm going to go into a couple positions of Hobbes, and Hobbes is best remembered as a political philosopher. I'm not going to focus on the political conclusions that Hobbes draws from his philosophy. I'm going to focus instead on what I'll call his philosophical anthropology. And by the way, in a sense, this is a good label for everything that we've talked about together the last couple of weeks. Anthropology, in the sense of trying to understand the fundamental aspects of human nature that we think make us who and what we are, and give us the value that we have for ourselves and for each other, and using philosophy, turning thought in upon itself, reflecting upon itself as a kind of naked medium, right? That there's no experiments, there's no surveys, there's not an effort to understand the biological basis for what we're talking about, just thought studying itself. That's philosophical anthropology. And Hobbes is perhaps the most explicit about this is what he's actually doing. And so we get from Hobbes a more developed epistemology that is willing to forego the religious foundations that Descartes ultimately grasps as his lifeline out of skepticism. And so here's what Hobbes says is going on when we think we understand something about the world. First, there's an object out there in the world. Second of all, there's a sensation that we have that we call our experience of the object. And so you're presumably looking at some kind of screen right now and having an experience of seeing me on that screen talking you through this diagram. And what Hobbes is suggesting is that the object is one thing and the sensation something else. That the object is a thing out there in the world that through motion creates an impression on our sense organs, vision, as well as hearing, primarily in this case, and that what vision and hearing give rise to is motion inside of us and ultimately a mental appearance. But that the mental appearance is always mediated by the sense and not a direct experience of the object. We are not equipped to directly experience the world, only to experience the world through the intermediary of our sense organs. And so the mental appearance should never be confused for the object itself. They are two completely distinct entities, and we don't really know how much correspondence there is or isn't between the mental appearance on the one hand and the object on the other. We then typically preserve some memory, some impression of the mental object, right? And so we've been doing this together for a long time. Presumably we have some memories of previous classes of what it's like to be together on Saturday mornings. And so we keep those in what Hobbes refers to as our imagination, right? That this is some capacity to not just experience what the senses give us of the world, but to preserve it in our imaginations for later. But please note that Hobbes thinks that imagination is imperfect, that it often decays, that you can't get every detail of the thing that you are remembering. And so imagination is still further removed from the object in the world. And then, by the way, to really be able to work with the imagination, right? We've got to attach words to it, because words are the stuff of thought. And if what we're talking about here is not just experience, but understanding, then we need to translate the mental appearance or the residual that we call imagination into words and then begin to do our reckoning, begin to do our thinking through. What did I learn from today's lecture? How does this relate to previous lectures, or ultimately to the question of what it's going to be like to share the world with intelligent machines? And at that point, we get to some understanding, right? But please note what Hobbes is ultimately saying is that understanding is several steps removed from the object itself, from reality. What we understand is a representation in words of a residual of an appearance that was given to us by our senses. We do not understand the world as such. And we just have to be honest about the fact. Just as with Marguerite's painting, that what we're seeing is a painting, or a painting of a painting, or a painting of a painting of a painting, and not the thing itself. And that this is just the nature of being human. We add to that then an account of why we act in the way that we act. And because Hobbes is a political philosopher, psychology is extremely important to him. He wants to understand, among other things, why war happens, why we fight and kill each other, when ultimately that destabilizes the whole social world. And without going into the political philosophy, let me just focus on the psychology. And Hobbes is ultimately someone who suggests we are driven by drives, or passions, as he calls them. And so to just fill this out, right, where there's an object in the world. Let's say that object is my cup of coffee, right? And I have a sensation. I take a little drink of my coffee, and that gives rise to a mental appearance, which I then preserve. The coffee is warm and bitter, and I get a little kick out of it, a little boost, right? And then I put it into words. There's caffeine in my coffee, and that is giving me a little bit of energy. And now I have an understanding of what coffee is and what coffee does. And I then may have a corollary passion, a desire or an aversion. And so my desire might be described as I need that boost. I'm running low on energy, and I got to get through this lecture. And so I want coffee. Or alternatively, it might be that I've had the experience in the past of having coffee too late in the day, and it keeps me up and makes me gnash my teeth at night, and I don't want any coffee after 4 p.m. I'm not going to have it anymore, right? And I'm being a little bit too cognitive about this. In a sense, chocolate would be the better example. Yummy, or I don't like it, it gives me heartburn. And then, according to Hobbes, we act. And why I say we've got to minimize the cognitive dimension to this, Hobbes' model really is one where the passion is an immediate reaction to the experience of the object itself, and we just act, right? I may trick myself into believing that I've decided to have a sip of coffee, but really it's just my desire that makes me have a cup of coffee. And this gets us finally to the third case, the illusion of freedom or voluntary action. And here Hobbes, right, goes all the way through everything we've talked about up until this point. The experience of the thing in the world is not the thing in the world. We eventually end up having it represented in words. We associate an aversion or a desire with it. I want it, I don't want it. But wait a sec, there's a contrary desire and or aversion, right? And so with regards to the chocolate, I want it, but I also recognize that I'm starting to gain weight, and that people don't think I'm as attractive when I've put on some pounds, and that the chocolate is very caloric, right? And so there's part of me that doesn't like what the chocolate does to me, or maybe it gives me a pimple, right? And so at that point, Hobbes says we have an experience, right? The experience is having conflicting desires and aversions, and having the latitude, therefore, to say to yourself, what am I going to do? I want it, but I don't want it. I want it, but I don't want it. And at some point on Hobbes' model, we basically arbitrarily choose, or to put it even somewhat more deterministically, there is a final desire or aversion. The desire for the chocolate gets the better over the worry about the pimple, and I have the chocolate, right? And his account suggests that when we think we are free to act, what we're really experiencing is the conflict of aversion and desire, but that really we are still stuck in a causal, deterministic, physical loop in which it's ultimately our passions and not our reason or deliberation determining what we do. And so Hobbes, as you can see, takes Descartes' skepticism and radicalizes it into a very diminished conception of human knowledge, human nature, human freedom. And he has his purposes for doing this. He wants us to be less in love with ourselves, less committed to our beliefs, less willing to die for them. And if we recognize that ultimately we don't have good grounds for believing what we believe, and that for the most part we're impelled into action by our passions, not by our reason, maybe we can stop going to war over our beliefs. And so there is a purpose behind this highly deflationary, critical view of human nature. And to be honest, it doesn't succeed very well in Hobbes' historical moment, but it does set the table for every philosopher who comes after Hobbes. And I'm making my way up to Kant. I have one more step before I get there, and that's David Hume, the incredibly important 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. And I'm just going to take a few ideas from Hume, and I want to be as clear as possible. Immanuel Kant, the perhaps greatest modern philosopher, would probably not have written everything that we remember him for, his three critiques in particular, had Hume not, and here I quote Kant, woken him from his dogmatic slumbers, right? And so Hume is very important in his own right, but for the purposes of today, I'm treating him as the person who transmitted Hobbesian skepticism to Kant and made Kant say, wait a sec, I've got to wake up and actually address these arguments, because if I don't, then everything I believe has been undermined. And so Hume, let me, like I say, just focus on a few ideas. In his treatise of human nature, the first book he published, one that had a very disappointing reception within his own lifetime, Hume said, among other things, that reason is the slave of the passions. And so, right, he's modifying Hobbes ever so slightly here and putting him in a slightly more respectable philosophical vernacular. But the key idea, I think, is very similar, which is when we experience ourselves as reasoning, as deciding, as deliberating about the right course of action, that is only because we have been motivated, not by reason itself. Reason doesn't have the power to motivate us, but instead by some pre-existing passion, sentiment, desire, aversion. And then reason helps us to figure out how we can get the thing we want, how we can avoid the thing we dread, right? And that is reason's role. It is a subsidiary and subservient mental capacity. Hume also takes very seriously this idea that we don't see the thing itself. We only have our mental representation of things. And he points out that therefore, our scientific ideas about causation remain hypotheses that we cannot rely on as certain predictions about the future. And so he's interested in induction, how I go from the knowledge that I've seen a bunch of examples of causation to the idea that the next time the pool cue strikes the ball, that the ball is going to move, right? And Hume says you can't, because that would involve being able to see causation, and being able to see causation would mean that you had a direct experience of the world. We don't have any direct experiences of the world. And so, yes, up until this point, every time the cue has struck the ball has moved, and that means that those two things have been constantly conjoined in past experience. That's what we mean by causation. But that doesn't mean we can be confident that it will continue into the future. And by the way, to the extent that the whole project of modern natural science is identifying causal rules that govern the things around us, modern science per se is speculative. This is what really shook Kant and made him feel like he had to respond to Hume. Justice, Hume says famously, is an artificial virtue, by which he means that we are not naturally just. There are some moral attributes that come to us naturally, like sympathy or pity or compassion. We don't like seeing sentient creatures suffer, especially our fellow human beings, especially those human beings with whom we have some sort of attachment or fondness. But having said that, that's not justice, right? Justice requires you often to punish someone who's done something wrong, which involves causing suffering, which involves overcoming your compassion, right? And he points out that whether it's telling the truth or respecting somebody else's property when you want what they have, children don't come into the world doing this stuff. Over time, they are taught that it's wrong to lie and steal, and a whole bunch of other norms that are essential to the way in which any civilized society functions, but not natural to human beings as such. And so this is a very important further development of the kind of philosophical anthropology that Hobbes was offering us. The next point that Hume makes, and again, with apologies for just pulling a few ideas out, but for our purposes, that's what we need: naturalism. And what Hume basically says, and he got this, I think, for the first time in philosophical history, really important idea worked out, and we've been working with it ever since, that naturalism tells us how the world works, right? And so you can say in the world there are predators and there is prey, and the way the world works is that predators eat prey, right? But if you then say, and that's how it ought to be, this is a purpose, this is the nature of things, and that somehow justifies this state of affairs, Hume thinks you have added something that is not included in the original statement. You have added what some people have come to call a normative converter, a new idea that takes the statement about the way the world is and says, and that's the way the world ought to be. And Hume says, but that's a non sequitur, right? Unless you give me an independent argument about why the world ought to be the way the world is, there is no normative force to your claim. You're just telling me the way the world is and adding at the last second by a philosophical sleight of hand something that you hope I won't notice that you've added. And please note how terribly corrosive this is for Plato and Aristotle, and the way in which their ideas have been taken up through this whole Christian theological tradition, because Aristotle, for instance, suggests if we understand that the acorn becomes the oak, we understand that the acorn ought to become the oak, that it aims to become the oak, that that's its purpose, that's its telos. Hume says, well, actually, no, that's just the way nature works. You can't get any normative conclusions out of that. And then when we take that to human beings, yes, perhaps we have these capacities for much more complex forms of action and contemplation that are realized if you put us in a society that allows us to exercise our political freedom or gives us the space, time, leisure, solitude to do philosophy. But that doesn't say that the exercise, development, and perfection of those capacities are per se valuable, right? That's just a non sequitur. We need an entirely different argument. And so the conclusion and what challenges Kant so greatly is that reason is far less powerful than we tend to think it is, that knowledge is much less secure, and that morality and justice are intrinsically weak and not rooted in nature as such. And Kant, who had been this brilliant, well-regarded teacher who had done really important work in both natural science and philosophy up until the point that he had read Hume, nevertheless would have been a minor figure in the history of thought had he not been fundamentally, deeply challenged, you might say rocked, by having read Hume's treatise and then his inquiry, and then saying, wait a sec, everything that I've been writing and teaching is ultimately resting on sand, that there's no firm grounds for me to believe that the natural sciences are actually describing the world, or that human morality is what I think it is, as opposed to merely dressing up our underlying animal nature. And so I'm going to stop there. I appreciate that you guys have let me cover a lot of territory today. I haven't heard anything from you guys yet. So I do want to know what questions, thoughts, ideas you have. Obviously, there's a big transition between the ancients and the moderns. Flossie, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself, remember?
No.
Yes. I'm so sorry, Flossie. You've got to keep holding it down, or else I hear you for a second and then I don't hear you anymore.
I am thinking of Marjorie Taylor Greene,
So
Can I
sorry to hear that.
say,
Go ahead.
shall I say more than that she is Mr. Trump's whore? Thing that even uncanny politicians can do to turn her around. I mean, we have a brain gone astray, and she is having her day. How do we get around it?
So I would love to have a good answer to your question, Flossie, and I am thinking, and let me tell you what I'm thinking about. Some of the people advising Donald Trump, and who are um, angling to help him constitute his next cabinet, his administration, should he win the election in 2024. And let us note, I don't know how you do the odds at this point, but there's a non-negligible chance that he'll be the next president of the United States. And so there are people around him trying to figure out, how he can overcome some of the checks, balances, limits, laws that kept him from doing what he wanted to do in his first term. And they are looking at ways of transforming the way in which the executive branch operates, the way in which the judiciary constrains the executive branch, and ultimately suggesting that liberal democratic ideas are creatures of a superseded past, right? We need to just overcome them, stop having nostalgia for them. They might have worked well in the middle of the 20th century, but we're not in the middle of the 20th century anymore. And our new social circumstances demand new laws, new norms, new approaches to government, much more unrestrained executive action. And if you hear in that very clear echoes of the rise of fascism in the 1920s and into the 1930s, I think that's correct. And I then want to add, by the way, the liberals in Germany and Italy and Spain got blindsided, right? That they didn't believe that anybody could take seriously these antiquated fascistic ideas, and it was too late by the time they were taking it seriously. Now, I'm not saying that had liberals taken fascists more seriously, the middle of the 20th century would have turned out differently. That's a bridge too far. But having said that, I don't think we should repeat the mistakes of the first half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century. I think we should be very concerned about the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, and she's kind of almost a caricature of this. But the people surrounding Trump, the people surrounding DeSantis, who really have this view of the unitary executive, the president is able to tell the Department of Justice and the FBI and everyone else in the executive branch to do exactly his will, never mind what the law or the prevailing norms are in those agencies. All that to say, I am really thinking about and worried about what you're talking about. But having said that, in a sense, the jumping off point for this class is a different jumping off point. And I'll put cards on the table here for a second. I'm also really worried about climate change. I'm also really worried about artificial intelligence. And the worry about artificial intelligence is a relatively new worry for me. Now that I'm doing research on it, I recognize that I may be late to the game, and there's some people who've been really worried about artificial intelligence for at least a decade. But I do have to say, whereas if you would have asked me 5 years ago, what's the chief existential threat to humanity, my answer would have been climate change followed by nuclear war, right? Or something like those two. And today, I would have to say climate change, artificial intelligence, nuclear war, and maybe in that order. And so the reason for this class is to think about artificial intelligence. Now, having said all of that, I also want to say they're not unrelated, right? If Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, I think the likelihood that we do anything about climate change or artificial intelligence is near zero, right? And the best prospect we have for using law and government to craft policies that actually rise to the challenge of meeting the dangers that face us in the 21st century is figuring out how to not just beat Donald Trump in 2024, but restore some sanity to our politics, which is a two-party affair, involves getting the Republicans to move away from a desire for strongman authoritarian rule and a willingness to deny obvious realities. And I'm not sure quite how to do that, other than to continue having these conversations in which we educate ourselves about these pressing issues and have for ourselves at our disposal the resources of argumentation that are not probably going to allow us to convince Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, and we can keep going down the list, but maybe to convince the swing voters in the critical states, the next generation of children and young adults coming of age who hopefully will do better than we do at facing these problems and returning some sanity into our politics. And so I wish there were a straight line from understanding what human reason is or why we should value it to being able to say, and by the way, those people have absolutely lost their minds. But I want to say, in a sense, they're very different gears, right? Right now we're in the slow, hard philosophical gear. At some point, we got to kick back into the political gear. But I hope you'll bear with me while I take you through some more philosophy for a while. We're going to have an awful lot of politics to talk about as we turn into the election season next year. Part of my idea was to take a break for a little bit. Bob's had his hand up, and then Marion, I see you as well. Bob, why don't you go ahead?
Just a couple of things that I'm not sure are particularly relevant, but that did occur to me as you were talking. The first is, what about psychedelic drugs and things like that, which are obviously going to scramble your understanding or your observation of this object over here, and how, if at all, does that affect the later events in the philosophical dialogue there? And the other is sort of at the opposite end. What about just a second, quantum mechanics, where it's all probabilistic? So when you were talking about the cue hitting the ball, what's the probability that the thing is actually going to do it and going to move it?
So I feel some qualification to talk about the first, maybe no qualification to talk about the second. The first is hallucinogens, psychedelics, right? And I'm going to get a little brain scientific for a second. The brain science that I'm studying to think about the second installment in these lectures refers to the default mode network, and so this is a network in the brain that arguably helps us to solve Descartes' underdeveloped theory of the self, right? It's taking all of these experiences we're having right now, right? So I'm sitting in a chair and I've got the experience of my tush on the cushion, but I'm not thinking very much about that, right? My attention is directed here, and the default mode network is this circuitry in the brain that helps me to determine which of the various stimuli that I'm subjected to at the moment should I be paying attention to? Should I be integrating into my sense of this is who I am and what is relevant to me right now? And it appears that part of what drugs like LSD or psilocybin mushrooms do is to slow down or altogether disable the operation of the default mode network. And so all of a sudden, one way to put this is, you've got a director in your brain and you have 20 cameras, and he's telling you which one to actually broadcast. And then all of a sudden the director shuts down and you're seeing all 20 cameras at once. And I'm not diminishing this. The research on this and Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, I think is very good at talking about the state of neuroscientific research on this, indicates that this can be profoundly transformative. It can be very beneficial for people who are depressed, especially if they're dealing with terminal diseases. But it can also change your understanding of yourself and your relationship with the world, because you may be stuck in certain habitual modes of thought, and then the default mode network shuts down and everything comes flooding in. And then once you're no longer under the influence of the drug, you remember and have to process and deal with the much richer and less defined range of experiences, thoughts, emotions that have flooded you during the hallucinatory experience. So yes, this is relevant, and relevant in particular to the question of what the I is and where it comes from, or how it is constructed, how we unify our experiences under the rubric of belonging and identity. They're all mine. It turns out there is an active center of processing in the brain, a network that is doing that work, and that we may benefit from having it shut down every now and then. By the way, it's worthwhile remembering that when Descartes did his meditations, did his philosophical experiment that really started his original philosophy, he was in a very hot room at night, and he essentially passed out. And there's a theory, a speculative theory, that Descartes essentially was having a hallucinatory experience that led him into the hypothesis that his senses were being manipulated by an evil demon. I'm not going to try to do anything with quantum mechanics here today, Bob. That's probably need to ask somebody else about that. But I don't think that's what Hume had in mind. He had in mind, as opposed to that, just the core idea which he got from Hobbes, which if our senses are giving us images in our mind that give us no direct access to the world itself, then we can never see causation. We can never actually understand what in the world makes it. We can only have our impression of it, and our impression of it is not enough to allow us to predict that it's going to necessarily, as a law, continue into the future. Marion, why don't I give you the last question for today? Go ahead.
Okay. All right. This has been fascinating to learn about the 17th and 18th century philosophers. The part that I couldn't relate to is when they say that the thoughts in the mind and the sensations that we have of the reality come from a God figure, that there's a God who has created the minds such as they are. And I don't know whether the Greeks talked about a God at all, but somewhere, between Hobbes and Hume, I guess, the thought came through that God is responsible for all of this, and all societies seem to believe this, and I just wonder where that notion ever got started.
So just an easy little question.
Easy question.
At the end of class, right? Let me try to answer it in a more narrow philosophical sense, right? And so there is an idea that is expressed in various ways in the history of philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and that is that humans have a fairly universal religious need. And that can be accounted for in different ways. One of them would be to say, just we want to understand why there's something instead of nothing, or ultimately we want to understand causation, but what caused the thing that caused the thing that caused the thing that caused the thing that I'm dealing with right now? And so that led Aristotle to postulate an unmoved mover, right? That there's something that started the whole causal chain that made our universe and the world that we live in. Because if we believe in causation, there's got to be some first cause, right? And by the way, I don't think physics has an answer to why there's something instead of nothing. There are ways of working from the first steps of the universe to the dark matter causing particles to collect to the Big Bang, right? But why is there dark matter? Why were there particles? Physics is not going to answer that for us, right? And there are other reasons we need religion. Why do bad things happen to good people? Are there rewards for doing the right thing even when it leads to bad outcomes for you? If those rewards are clearly not going to be in this world, is there a next world? And is there some aspect of you that survives into the next world? And so all of that to say, right, that and by the way, where do my parents go when they're gone? Are they just gone? Or is there something that continues of their essence after physically they're no longer with me in this world? And so these I think you might want to even call them abiding anthropological universals. Everywhere we look, people are wrestling with these questions, have led people to turn to various religious systems. And then I think we might want to add that perhaps the monotheological or the cosmological, the religions that take the form of Abrahamic religion, right? Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism, or maybe Hinduism, right? That these religions answer these questions in ways that permit systematically consistent answers to these questions, that most humans seem to be perplexed by. And that at least until the advent of the age of science, we didn't have any other answers, right? That this helps to account for, if you start from a secular or irreligious perspective, why there's religion in the world, even if you don't believe that it's true. And then you add to that, and I think Descartes is the really critical figure here, because it's Descartes who has simultaneously radical doubt and radical faith, and uses his faith to get out of his doubt, right? That there are periods in human history where there is one religion that is hegemonic, right? And not only hegemonic in answering religious questions, but often in answering political questions. Who should the king be? Who should the ruler be? As well as scientific questions. How do the heavens work? Well, we can turn to theology to answer that question, because the heavens were, of course, designed by God. And when you're in that universe, everybody seems to believe the same religion. Everybody really is afraid of damnation, and therefore regards being appropriately religious as essential to eternal salvation. That then religion really becomes incredibly powerful. And in perhaps our historical moment, for many of us, it's a little hard to understand how religion could be so powerful. But in the historical moment in which Descartes is writing, it is just really part of the air that everyone breathes, taken for granted, hegemonic. And people, please remember, are fighting and dying over these issues in some of the bloodiest, worst warfare in human history. So they're really very serious about their religious belief. Thank you for that question, Marian. The questions are great. Please keep them coming. I'm going to continue with this unless until something really big political blows up, and then we'll take a break. But I want to get us into and through Kant, and then through Hegel and Nietzsche's reaction to Kant. That's where we're going next, and then we'll have enough philosophy in our wheelhouse to begin working our way through the psychology as well. Take care, everyone. Wonderful being with you. Be well, stay cool, and I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.